Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see you here again after trying to remember. I don't think we were here last week, were we, James? But it's so nice to see everyone again. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about what makes both the experience of studying at and the application process to Oxford and Cambridge different from other universities today. We're talking through that. I have 36 slides, and we'll be talking a little bit about the support that UniAdmissions offer, and then we'll be taking a few questions at the end. So hopefully we should have everything wrapped up by about 3 o'clock, and hopefully we'll have all learned something. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Matt. I look after the research team here at UniAdmissions. So my job is to make sure that everything that comes up in the following slides is based on evidence, is true to the best of our ability to work these things out. And I'm joined this week by my colleague, James. James, who are you? Why are you here?
That is a very good question. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm James. I essentially have conversations with parents and students and sort of explore your application and, work out whether you would be a good fit to work with us, on a program, really, and give you some kind of guidance on how to submit the best application.
Fab. Thanks, James. As I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to be talking this week about the things that make the process of applying to Oxford and Cambridge different, as well as some of the things that are different once you get there, which obviously play into one another. One of the reasons you want to go is because it's different, right? And then next week, we won't be doing anything because it's Easter. I'll be busy reflecting on the 14 Stations of the Cross. And then the following week, we will be talking about what it takes to become a doctor. I know that becoming a doctor has become increasingly popular over the last couple of years. Can't imagine why. Hasn't been any medicine in the news, but we'll be looking at that week after next. So I've sort of divided this up into some big picture topics this week. So first, we're going to be talking about what makes studying at Oxbridge different, why it might appeal to you, and what to sort of bear in mind in your application when you're thinking about that. We'll be looking at what parts of the application are particularly important and how you can adopt a strategic approach to putting that application together. And we'll also be talking a little bit about what kind of thing you can expect from the interview, although that's something we're going to be going into a lot more detail in later in the year. So I think we'll probably be spending a little bit more time on the other two questions. So first off, what makes studying at Oxbridge different from studying elsewhere? So I've kind of grouped this into three broad themes. And the first of these is the small group teaching. At Oxford, they call it a tutorial. At Cambridge, they call it a supervision. You'll find, thinking about these universities, that there are a lot of instances where they do more or less the same thing, but they have subtly different words for it. And as the picture suggests, this is a kind of teaching where you'll be spending time in small groups with an academic from your college, focusing on an essay you've written on new pieces of work that you're interested in. And this really is unique to Oxford and Cambridge. No other universities really have the level of staffing or the small number of students that make this possible. And so for most people who are applying, this is really the big selling point. It's the chance to work closely with researchers, with professors, in a way that really isn't possible at other universities for the most part, because you might be in your college among 15 or 20 people studying law at Oxford, whereas if you were to go and do that at UCL, you would be among 150 or 200 people. And so that scale of difference is something that's really important to people. We mentioned there the college, being represented here by this authentically dreadful furniture, which from my time at Cambridge, I can tell you is absolutely accurate. The buildings are beautiful and the furniture is horrendous. You will be in that much closer-knit environment of the college, you and maybe 300 other students, living on site, eating on site, going to the college bar, It's a very small, very intense place, and it's a completely different experience from, again, what you would get at UCL or another university where there might be 2,000 or 3,000 students in your year, and I think something like 20,000 students overall at UCL this year. You within your college, you might quite plausibly know the names of almost everyone. You're talking about a really close-knit setting, and for a lot of people that's really appealing. The other thing to think about are the facilities. Even a bog standard PowerPoint presentation like this one takes place on a really grand scale at Oxford and Cambridge. The riches of the colleges mean that there are all sorts of opportunities, all sorts of facilities, all sorts of things for you to get involved in that might not exist at other universities. Each college will have its own theatre. It will have spaces like this. It may have its own college orchestra. There are opportunities available because of the smallness of the colleges, because of the riches of the colleges, that you're just not going to get anywhere else. And all of those are things that you should be taking into account when you're thinking about whether Oxford and Cambridge are right for you. So hopefully you are decided that it's right for you. If not, please do stick around for the rest of the webinar, but don't feel obliged. We're going to talk now about what are the important factors when it comes to putting together your application. Needless to say, it's a little bit competitive getting into Oxford or Cambridge, so having a clear idea of what you're doing in the application is really important. And so my colleague James is going to talk a little bit about the different weights that we assign to parts of the application and the logic behind that. Over to you, James.
Excellent. The pie chart. Yeah, so actually when I speak to parents and students, oftentimes nobody really has a clear sense of actually how they're being assessed when they apply to Oxford and Cambridge. They understand that there are tests and that there's an interview and there's personal statement, etc. But they don't really know how the universities actually assess the students and compare those students with one another. So I think this pie chart is just a really nice visual representation of exactly how this works. And a lot of students and parents are surprised to know that actually grades are really, really small part of actually the decision-making process. So they account for about 10% of the overall decision. 40% is based on the admissions test. Another 40% typically is based on the interview. And then the final 10% we sort of call everything else. So it's the personal statement, submitted work, UCAS reference, and sort of other less tangible things. So obviously the reality is it's very, very competitive. So everything has to be very, very good. You do need very, very good grades, of course, but actually it's the test and the interview which really will determine whether you get an offer or not, because the grade profiles of students applying tend to be pretty much the same. It's not really a way for the universities to differentiate candidates. So they really use the test and the interview as ways to do that. I think later on we'll look at some test data, and that really kind of highlights that. There's such a clear correlation between test score and sort of interviews and offers. So that should be quite interesting later on. But when you're going about preparing for your application this year, this is really important. There's no point spending all of your time on your A-levels and then spending 3 weeks over the summer preparing for the test. The test is far more important than the grades ultimately. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, James. As James mentioned, the weight of the exam grades has diminished in recent years. And the reason for this is twofold. If we look at the rate at which A's and A stars have gone up in recent years, there has been a huge jump around the last 2 years with the pandemic and the centre assigned grades. And we see the same effect in GCSEs as well. Very close to double the rate of students getting an A or above at GCSE compared with 20 years ago. What this means for universities is, because the grades that students have been awarded aren't based on them having sat the same exam on the same day, it's very difficult to make that like-for-like comparison. And that's why the admissions tests have become so much more important, because for many students, it will be the only example of every person who applied having done the same test on the same day and having directly comparable marks that they can actually use to determine which students are more and less able. Obviously, this is very frustrating for students, but the good news is it means you have a lot of control over where you're going with your application, because of the weight of those admissions tests and the relative down weighting of GCSEs. So if we're thinking about application strategy, the first point I like to emphasize to students is neither of them are easier to get into. The rate of application success for Cambridge is a tiny bit higher than for Oxford, but only kind of on a population level and not in a way that would be helpful to the average student. And that's very much influenced by the intense competition for one or two courses at Oxford. That accounts for more than half of the difference. And so once you're away from that, you are really looking at the difference of 2 or 3 percentage points, which really isn't very much at the individual level. One thing that is different is that Oxford interview a lot fewer people than Cambridge do. This tends to be because Oxford will accommodate people overnight. They will interview people maybe 2 or 3 times with different colleges, or at least that was the system back in the olden days when these things were done in person. My understanding is that the universities have, I believe, James, already decided that they're not going to be doing things in person this year, which seems a little premature.
Yeah, so my understanding is that it's going to be virtual. I mean, ultimately, logistically, it is kind of easier for the universities, right?
Oh, you say that. I have a contact at Oxford who says that she hates it and everyone else hates it. Yeah, our understanding is at present they've both committed to doing these things virtually. I hope they change their minds, because I think the virtual experience isn't as good as the in-person one. I think people interview worse. I think it's harder to tell who is really exceptional. And most of all, you know, a majority of people who are interviewed don't get in, and going up there to visit, spending a day, maybe even a day or two there, you know, getting to have a little bit of the experience, that's really nice. I don't think it's a pity people are missing out on that. But as I said, the level of competition for each place is pretty similar between the two once you line up the subjects. But there are a handful of courses that are crazy competitive. We'll be talking about this, I imagine, in a few weeks' time. We go into more detail on the data that we have for the new admissions cycle that normally comes out in May. But there are some courses that are really, really competitive. And so if you're considering applying for PPE, for economics and management, for computer science, to a lesser extent for economics and for maths, we really do recommend looking into adopting a strategic approach that we're kind of going to talk about, because those are such difficult subjects to get into. So it may be that you are, it's only April this week. It may be that you haven't chosen what subject you're going to go for yet. Now, of course, a lot of the subjects at university are different from those that you might have studied at school. There are additional nuances. There are subjects that simply don't exist at school. I don't believe anyone does biochemistry for GCSE. I don't think it exists. And there is a lot of variation for competition between these courses. For example, it is more than twice as hard to get in for biochemistry as for chemistry at Oxford. So if you're on the fence about that one, I would consider chemistry, because, you know, you've got a slightly better odds there. Don't know why everyone loves biochemistry so much at the moment. Another thing to think about is the role of the gap year. Because it's harder to remember how to do maths, we generally don't recommend that you take a gap year if you're going for a STEM subject. But our experience is it doesn't tend to do much harm for I was about to say for humans studying the students. No, for students studying in the humanities. Maybe that's because humanities degrees are easier. Having done one, I think that's probably true. We mentioned PPE and computer science a moment ago. So less than 1 in 8 students get an offer for PPE at Oxford. It's only just half that rate for students applying for economics and management, and a tiny number again for students applying for computer science at Cambridge. So bear in mind that if you're applying for one of these subjects, they are really, really competitive, very prestigious. So you want to be thinking really carefully about how you're planning your application, but also bear in mind, thinking about that gap year note we just mentioned, absolutely nothing wrong with applying this year, not getting in and going for it again next year. That's entirely normal. And I think our data suggests that something like between a quarter and a third of people who are studying PPE, they're getting on their second attempt. So, you know, very, very competitive subjects indeed. So what does this mean for you sort of overall when we're thinking about the context of your application? I think the first and most important thing to bear in mind is that you still have a lot of control over how your application shakes out. The grades you've achieved at GCSE, or A-level predictions, they aren't going to be an enormous factor. The really important things are making sure that you do really well on that admissions test, making sure that you've got a good personal statement put together, and making sure that you're, you know, focusing your energy in a smart way. If you can scrape a few marks together higher up on the Bmat, on the TSA, on whatever the test might be, that's going to have a much bigger impact on your chances than anything else. Now, I mentioned the personal statement there briefly. We'll be spending a lot more time on this in a few weeks because I think it's a little early to be thinking about the personal statement in too much detail. I think people have a tendency to spend too long on it anyway. So I don't want to talk about it too much at this early stage, you know, just don't want to encourage people in the wrong direction. The thing to bear in mind is the personal statement isn't as big a deal as you think. On the whole, the reference you get from your school is just as important, perhaps even more important. And that the personal statement, it's not going to get you a place, but it can definitely lose you one. If your personal statement is a mess, if you come out with some really wacky opinions in your personal statement, there are opportunities there to make life really hard for yourself. So my message about the personal statement would be to kind of chill out to the best of your ability. You know, there are things you should still be doing. You want to be showing your passion for the subject. You want to be evidencing that. You want to have different books and different ideas, ideally different books and different ideas from other applicants. If you're applying for law, resist the temptation to use Eve Was Framed. If you're applying for English, don't just use the books you read for GCSE or A-level. Make sure you're showing a breadth of reading, and just have a bit of personality to it. You're selling yourself, right? And so you want to have a little bit of sense of fun, a sense of passion, a sense of, you know, humanity. Make sure that it's a pleasant thing to read and the person reading it might be interested in you. Speaking about the wrong books, I think I've probably told James this before, but I was reviewing personal statements 2 or 3 years ago, and there was a chap who was applying for English, and every single one of the books that he had cited was about a man being falsely accused of rape. All of them. And so you can go with that if you like, but probably you may not necessarily come across a sympathetic reader. You don't want to suggest that you're unduly interested in troublesome topics. You know, look at a breadth of ideas, a breadth of different authors, periods, styles, genres. Really show off what you're interested in, and don't be afraid to have some real personality to it, because ultimately they're picking a person to work with for the next several years. So, you know, don't be afraid to let your personality out in the personal statement. Another thing to note here is, unlike in the States, extracurricular activities, they don't count. It's just academic merit. If you're really good at rugby, that's great, but no one cares. If you've just come off a hugely successful Winter Olympics, that's great. But if you've got 3 Bs at A-level, no one cares. If you want to get involved in debating clubs, if you want to get involved in music, if you want to get involved in college sport. These are all great opportunities. There are wonderful things you can do, but you've got to get in first. That's some fun stuff you can do after your lectures. They're not something that you can put in your application. They're not something you can do in place of knowing the subject. I know for Cambridge in particular, there's a strong history of Cambridge students going on to become successful comedians. You can try and write a really funny personal statement, but if you're applying to study biology, well, natural sciences it would be, you want to make it about natural sciences. You don't want to make it about how funny you are. You can be funny once you get in, but don't overemphasize that on the application form. That's not what this is about. So we've talked about the personal statement. We've talked about choosing your subject. And there are a couple of questions already coming through in the Q&A about how we came to the weights that we use in our pie chart. Now, the most rigorous part of this is the way that we are able to weight the admissions tests. Almost every subject at Oxford or Cambridge has an admissions test. Oxford, normally you'll sit these a couple of weeks after the UCAS deadline, normally something like the 2nd or 3rd of November. Cambridge, some of them will be during that same session, and some of them will be done while you're visiting Cambridge for interview, or during the kind of interview period if it's being done virtually. It varies from subject to subject, it varies from year to year. We do our very best to keep our information up to date, so please do check in with us if you're uncertain. But there is a strong chance that whatever subject you're applying for, there'll be some kind of test. And as we've talked about already, these tests are really important. Now, to kind of illustrate this, I've pulled out, this is the test for physics at Oxford. And as you can see, the correlation between scores on the test and whether or not you get in it's extremely clear. Beyond a certain threshold on the, I'm going to sort of spotlight this as we go, I think. Beyond a certain threshold on the test, you're simply not going to get an interview. Beyond, let's see if I can change the color. Here we are. Beyond about 42 points, 42%, you're just not getting an interview. You might be lucky. There are very small numbers of candidates getting interviews at these score levels, but it really isn't happening very much. You might be one of the lucky ones, but those are students who perhaps have really good reasons for having performed poorly in the test. Perhaps their mother died the previous day. Perhaps they're coming from a disadvantaged background. Essentially, if you want to get an interview, you want to be over here in this section, because as we reach a certain inflection point in the test score, around 67, 68%, everyone who scores that well gets an interview. Below that score, plenty of people get an interview, but at a certain point, as you can see here, everyone gets an interview. Now, to get in, you need to have an interview. So that's a strong start. Then if we look at the smaller curve here, what we see is that people start getting offers even down here in this kind of exceptional zone at the bottom. But the number of offers really doesn't get going until we get into the middle section here, over about 60%. And the share of people getting offers becomes a larger and larger share of the people being interviewed, right up to the point where if we go down to the end, those students who are scoring in the top 15% or so, pretty much all of them are getting in. Suddenly you're odds on at this end of the distribution from being in a position where you weren't even odds on to get an interview 20 or 30 points lower. And this is why we're so confident about the weight of the admissions test in the pie chart that we put forward earlier. If anything, we perhaps undersell it. And that's simply to say that we can see through these data that the correlation is incredibly strong. We're talking R's in the 60s and 70s. It's a really clear, well, 0.6, 0.7. Sorry, I was thinking in basis points. A really clear relationship. And we see the same thing with the test for maths. Again, at Oxford, your chances of getting an interview go up as you do better. Your chance of getting an offer go up as well. And beyond a certain point, everyone's getting an interview. and almost everyone is getting a place at the very high end of the score distribution there. We mentioned earlier the relative odds of different subjects at Oxford and Cambridge. As you can see, things have been getting more competitive with time over the past several years. Part of this is down to demographic factors, the changing number of 18-year-olds in the UK. But as you can see, the long-term trend is a very slow decline in the chances of getting that, that coveted place, to the point where you're looking at somewhere between 15 and 18% chance of getting into Oxbridge. Now, that's not unachievable, but as you've seen with the admissions tests graph, the biggest tool you have in your arsenal is to be, well, you would have a weapon in an arsenal rather than a tool. You have a tool in a toolbox. The biggest weapon in your arsenal is that admissions test because of the strength of that correlation. So I've talked a great deal, I realize, half an hour, gosh. So I just wanted to draw a few conclusions before I hand over to James for a little while to talk about the ways in which we can support you, because it isn't just PowerPoint. What I wanted to say was moving 7 or 8 or 9 points in terms of your admissions test performance can double your chance of being interviewed. That may take you from a position where you are 50-50 to get an interview to suddenly being comfortably odds on. The admissions tests, they're the only like-for-like comparison the universities are able to make between students at the moment. Hopefully exams will go back to normal this year, and that will make things much easier for the next cohort of students. But unfortunately, because of the way that centre assessed grades have come out, those admissions tests have taken on even more importance. And so I would say, particularly at this stage, spending that extra time on the admissions test, figuring out your revision plan, all of those things are going to be more valuable than worrying too much about your personal statement. There are a lot of good things you can do with your personal statement, but the admissions test is going to be the decisive factor. So please do spend more time on that. Now, I understand, James, that we can help. I certainly hope so. Can we?
We can indeed. Yes, we can.
Wow. So tell me about it, James. Well, actually, don't tell me because I wrote the slides. Tell our lovely guests.
Okay. Yeah. Well, guys, if you haven't realised by now, we are a prep school. So essentially, we're supporting students applying for Oxford and Cambridge, and in terms of medicine, other universities as well. And essentially, we have programs of support to help students. So we know it's very, very competitive, and it can often be quite overwhelming. So the idea is to have a very clear structure through a program so that you can be very effective in the way that you're preparing. So yeah, we have programs. Typically, there are sort of 4 parts to a program, which I'll sort of give you a little bit of an overview of. So the first part, excellent. Okay. First part is one-to-one tuition. So the idea is that we're going to match you with a tutor who themselves studied your kind of chosen subject at your chosen university. So if you're applying for maths at Oxford, you'd work with a tutor who themselves studied maths at Oxford. And the idea here is that they would work with you to help you prepare, develop and write your personal statement, to prepare for your admissions test, to prepare for your interview, and give you that kind of really one-on-one support. So that would be the first part, one-to-one tuition. Secondly, would be our resources. So we actually, as a preparation school, we've published over 80, I believe it's 80 now, Matt, books for the Oxbridge and medicine applications. So as part of our program, students work with our books. We have an online preparation portal that is sort of the hub of the program. So it's where we have kind of reading lists. It's where students work through our academies for tests and interviews and personal statements. We work through a series of kind of learning, revising and testing for the admissions tests. So breaking down, the test itself, looking at kind of the content knowledge, looking at strategy, technique elements of tests, working through time question banks, doing mock tests. which is really important. Students submit their written work, they submit their personal statements for feedback as well. What's really key in all of this, though, is that there's a really clear curriculum. So there's a really clear structure of how you engage with these materials. So you know exactly what you need to be doing week in, week out. So that is the resources. Thirdly, are the weekly enrichment seminars. So what these are small group sessions. So we have our students, applying for medicine together. We have our kind of law applicants, economics applicants, and so on. And these are small kind of discussion sessions each week. The aim is to replicate those kinds of tutorials or supervisions at Oxbridge. And the reason for this is when you're applying, lots of students will do wider reading, which is great. But actually what you're being assessed on in your interview is your ability to reflect on and discuss what you've read. And most students just never practice that. Students will do lots and lots of reading, but when they get into an interview, very difficult to hold a conversation about a topic and be able to draw on the reading and things that they've done. So each week we look at a different topic within your subject, and then we kind of go through sort of discussing and reflecting on that and building that skill. So those are weekly. And then to tie it all together, we have some intensive courses. So these take place sort of later in the year, closer to the deadlines of your application. And the aim of them are to consolidate all of the preparation that you've been doing. So, there's an intensive day course for the test, a 2-day intensive course for the interview. So really just making sure everything's where it needs to be, that there are no gaps and that you're fully prepared, really. And they kind of serve as a final springboard into those different application hurdles. And typically that's what a program looks like. The idea of a program, as I say, is just to give you some structure. What we tend to see for students who don't work with this sort of program is, either they just don't do anything because they don't really know where to start, they don't know what resources to use, they just sort of feel a bit paralyzed, or to overcompensate for not having any kind of structure. They do far too much and they don't really do it in an effective way. So yeah, structure is really, really important. It's hard to have structure yourself. I think most people would agree. Yes, Matt, that's the program.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, James. Now, the good news is that all of this seems to work. Our success rates are really good. We're very proud of them. We're in the process of recalculating them for this past season. Hopefully, we'll have those up on the website soon. And we're very proud that they compare flatteringly with even the most prestigious schools in the UK at a much lower cost. And unlike Eton, no funny outfits. No funny outfits here at all. Now, all of this, I appreciate, may come across a little intimidating. So there are a couple of final points I wanted to raise. The first is that for us, the ideal student is much more about the positivity, the passion, the enthusiasm you bring to it. We encounter plenty of students who have the grades, but they don't have the attitude. They're unpleasant and arrogant, and for the most part, we choose not to work with them. We would much rather that this was an ambition, that you were pushing yourself, that you were going to really achieve something, that you really cared about it, than that you felt that you were in some sense entitled. And that's very much us taking the same approach as the universities themselves, who are much more interested in students who are there to learn than, as occasionally you find with the more arrogant students, the ones who present themselves as if they're there to teach. Finally, though, please do say something nice about us on Trustpilot. Other people are doing it. I recommend going to have a look, especially say something nice about me. I would greatly appreciate that. Do tune in to Rohan, our founder, and Will, one of our lead consultants' podcasts. They've yet to invite me to be on the podcast, which I remain furious about, but listen to it nevertheless. And unless you've got anything else, James, I think we'll go into some Q&A.
Yeah, no, I haven't been on the podcast either, Matt. Although I'm very happy to say I am now mentioned in a number of reviews. So
Oh,
That's kind of exciting stuff.
Well, if you do nothing else after this, please say something nice about me on Trustpilot. I don't care about anything else you might do, only care about that. So, questions. We can do our very best to answer as many questions as we can. However, sometimes the questions that people ask are the kind of questions where I have to look something up. All the kinds of questions that go into quite a lot of personal detail about your circumstances. If this is the case, please do book a consultation with us so we can give you a proper answer. The consultations are free, no commitment, just a chance for us to have a conversation with you, figure out what you need, figure out whether we can supply it, and to really begin to develop that relationship. And as I said, if you have a conversation with difficult questions that I'm going to struggle to answer without doing a little bit of research, the beauty of the consultation, it gives me a little bit of time because I'm not trying to do a PowerPoint presentation at the same time as having the conversation. So on to some questions. We have a couple of questions already about quite a few questions about the Bmat, James. Are you happy to jump onto those?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's have a look. So somebody asks, have you got any recommendations for properly preparing for the Bmat? Well, actually, I think this kind of relates to both the Bmat and all of the other admissions tests, in that it's not necessarily a test of the content knowledge. These tests are difficult because of the time pressure, and actually having a really clear understanding of how to approach the test makes a big difference. You know, for example, in the Bmat section 2, it's a lot more about pattern recognition. It's a lot more about techniques for taking the test than it is about the content knowledge. So when you prepare, practice is good. You know, you've got to do lots and lots of practice, but actually you've got to understand how to approach the tests. So, you know, that's not easy to do, but that's something that I would recommend. That's something obviously that we focus on when we help students, because that makes the difference at the top end of your score. You've seen there's this enormous sort of traffic jamming in the middle. So often students who get top scores in the tests have a better understanding of how to approach the test. That was a long-winded answer, but there you go. That's for that question.
Yeah, I think the thing to bear in mind there, James, is the Bmat is a really fast test. In the first section, you will have barely 2 minutes per question to read it, to figure out what the question's actually asking you, and then to answer it. And so figuring out strategies for speed is really important for the Bmat. It is, and this may seem obvious, the first question is worth just as many marks as the last question. But what you will see with many students is they will spend 5 minutes on the first question and 90 seconds on the last question. Now, that isn't a sensible division of time. You want to be spending as much time on each question because they're all worth just as many marks. It's something I requested data from, and Cambridge admissions have turned me down. So I'm fighting that one at the moment through the Information Commissioner. But I have a very strong suspicion that students perform slightly less well at the beginning of the test, that their chances of getting the question right improve, and that they tail off towards the end because they run out of time. Having a clear sense of timing makes a huge difference in these tests. And that's one of the #1 things you can practice, is making sure that you can actually answer every question, giving all of them the right amount of time and attention in the time limit. Because the last thing you want to do is spend 7 minutes on a question you find really difficult and not get to question 31, which it turns out would have taken you 15 seconds because it was really easy. Cool. So there was a request for the distribution of Bmat scores. We will definitely be talking about that in a future episode. I'm not sure when, possibly in June, maybe May, but we'll definitely be talking about the Bmat in excruciating detail. I don't know how far back the archive goes, James, but I believe I did this in excruciating detail in November, maybe?
There've been many a sort of focus on the Bmat, yeah.
And so if you want to go back through our sort of archive of these open days, there are loads, I think close to 100 of them now. And there is definitely one in there where I spent an hour and a half talking about the Bmat with lots of graphs, if that's the kind of thing you enjoy. It's the kind of thing I enjoy, but I wouldn't want to force it on anyone. So please do go and have a look. and we'll almost certainly be coming back to it as we get more data. And that will also answer the question about what kinds of scores make a competitive application for Oxbridge when it comes to the Bmat. And if you're keen to help, no, we're keen to help. If you're keen to have some of our help about the Bmat, please do get in touch, and we can sign you up that way. Let me have a quick look at a couple of quick ones. Daniela asks, are SAT or ACTs in school important? No. Nope, not at all. Oxford and Cambridge, no UK university cares. They will not read them. You can send them to them and they'll put them in the bin. They're not interested. They're only interested in in your exam grades, your personal statement, and your test scores. American tests, they don't care. It's nice that you've done them. Maybe it'll be good practice for any other test, but no, no one cares. Sorry. If you did really well on the SAT, I'm sure that's disappointing, but I'm sorry. There we go. We have a question about A-levels. Do you need to do a 4th A-level or is 3 fine? James, I didn't do 4 A-levels. They hadn't even invented the A-star when I was a child, which was, well, if anyone wants to take a look, ages ago. Tell us about the 4th A-level.
So it's a good question, actually. It's quite a common question. I think it's all about balance. If you can do 4 A-levels and you are confident that alongside those 4 A-levels, you can also be well prepared for the application, then fine. But actually, if you had 2 sort of students, you had one student with 3 A stars and you had another student with 3 A stars and an A, then actually the first student would be a stronger student in the eyes of the university. So actually, you only really need to do 3 A-levels and just get the best grades in those 3 A-levels that you can. Even if you did 4 A-levels and you got 4 A stars and you got a mediocre admissions test score, and somebody else did 3 A-levels and got a very high admissions test score, that student with the higher test score is going to be the more credible candidate. So really, 4th A-level isn't necessary at all. If you want to do it because you're really passionate about a 4th subject, and you're really, really confident that you can achieve 4 A stars, sure. But don't do it out of fear that only having 3 isn't enough, because it is, as long as you do well in those 3 and get a good test score. Would you second that, Matt?
Absolutely. 3 is the normal number. You can do 4 if you really want to, but unless you have a really specific reason, I wouldn't normally recommend it. Of course, it does depend on the A-levels. If you are doing, let's say, chemistry, physics, and maths, I think it makes perfect sense to do further maths as a 4th choice if you really don't want to give up chemistry. However, if you're thinking of doing history, chemistry, maths, and French, I would not suggest that. Those are all difficult, and there isn't enough of an overlap between them. Doing further maths will make maths easier. Doing French will probably not make a huge difference to how well you do at chemistry. So on the whole, unless you can make them really complementary, I wouldn't recommend it. The only exception to this I've ever come across was a student we worked with 3 or 4 years ago who wanted to do a 4th A-level in Japanese. Now, it turned out he was Japanese, and he found the A-level very easy on account of how he already knew Japanese. In that instance, I think that's fine, because my understanding is he didn't revise. He just showed up and he got 98%, and the question he got wrong was something that he disputed, and it was a question of interpretation of the Japanese language. So unless you're going to find it that easy, I would generally stick to 3, or if you're doing further maths as your 4th, in which case it's kind of more of a 3.5 than a 4 almost. Lovely. Let me come back to these questions. Ed asked a couple of questions about disrupted study and disadvantages. Both Oxford and Cambridge are very careful about making sure that all of these things are well tracked in the application. I would recommend getting in touch with the university about these sorts of things directly to understand what weight they give them. I have a good friend who works at Oxford in this particular area, and they do take it really seriously. So I would say get in touch with the university in the first instance to figure out what adjustments they might be able to make, how that sort of thing is taken into account. And get in touch with us also, as we have a very generous program through the UniAdmissions Foundation. which essentially means that if you're worried about affording our services, don't worry about it. Chances are they'll be free. I hope that helps. Waiwa asks about competitiveness. It's hard to tell until afterwards. We will know a lot more in about 6 weeks' time when the latest year's data has come through. The long-term trend is that things are getting more competitive at Oxford and Cambridge gradually, but we are also at a demographic low point for number of 18-year-olds in the UK. My guess is that things will get stuck around the 15% mark for both universities, but certainly the grade inflation, I don't think it's made things more competitive, but it certainly has made things more challenging for the universities. And so it means getting that, that great personal statement, that wonderful test score is all the more important, because you can't fall back on your A-levels or GCSEs in the way that you might have once been able to. I think that covers questions about contextualization as well. Most everyone who applies will have an admissions test, but it depends subject by subject and university by university. There's been a question about this through the chat as well. We know as much as you know from the university websites. If they haven't announced it publicly, they haven't told us in secret. So that's absolutely the best place to check for the information. We update all of our resources as quickly as we can when those things change. And we put a lot of effort and time into those resources, which goes on to another question. The NSAA, James, do we have questions?
We do, yeah, we have a significant amount of questions. So, we've talked about practicing in a timed scenario. That's really, really important. So of course you need quite a lot of questions in order to do that. So yes, I mean, all of the kind of tests that we have this process of, learn and revise and test. So in revise, we have timed question banks. Typically we're looking at, 1,000 questions for something like, the Bmat, and the same for, most other STEM subjects as well. Yeah.
Chances are you won't run out of questions. If you do run out of questions, hopefully you'll have forgotten some of them so you can do them again. But if you find that you've run out of questions on our question banks, let us know and we'll get someone to write some more. Plus, at that point, you can help us improve them, because you'll probably really know what you're doing. But we do have a lot of questions available. And those are developed by our tutors in concert with the syllabus. We put a lot of effort into making sure that they are of the right level and standard. And I believe we've been able to get a couple of people who've been question writers for the NSA and the Bmat to collaborate with us over the years as well, which is always nice. We have a couple of questions about medicine that I want to address quickly. So Cambridge has a lot more places for medicine than Oxford. A lot of people know this. This is basically because there is a very large teaching hospital just outside Cambridge called Addenbrooke's, and it is much bigger than the hospital at Oxford. So there is a much larger intake each year of medics at Cambridge than Oxford. So if you're in two minds, I would lean towards Cambridge simply because they take on more people. Doesn't necessarily mean it's easier to get in, but it does mean that more people get in. And this is something we'll be talking about in much more detail in 2 weeks' time. We'll be focusing exclusively on medicine. And there's also a question about work experience for medicine. Obviously, the situation with work experience has been very difficult over the past, 25 months? It's been ages. It's been bad for ages. And that means that a lot of students are going to be applying without medical work experience. Now, what I would say is medical work experience can be a lot of things. We're not saying you have to stand behind a surgeon doing open heart surgery. We're not suggesting you have to shadow a GP. Anything that clarifies your motivation to study medicine will do. You can go and spend time volunteering in a care home. You could go and spend time volunteering in a food bank. Anything that helps you develop those key medical skills. That doesn't need to be research. That doesn't need to be research science. That can be empathy. That can be bedside manner. Really, my experience is that there are plenty of students who apply to medicine and discover once they get there that actually what they wanted to be was research scientists or biochemists, or on some level they wanted to be lawyers because they wanted to be important and prestigious. And the difficulty with being a doctor is some of it is boring, some of it is gross, and a lot of it is old people and unhappy sick people. Believe it or not, medicine, a lot of sick people. And so I would always recommend almost finding the least prestigious, most gross bit of work experience you can. Go and spend time volunteering with a cancer charity, go and spend time working with the disabled, go and work in a care home. Those are going to be much more valuable experiences in terms of clarifying why you want to be a doctor than spending time doing something high status with a lot of computers. It's cool that you've done that, but it won't tell you if you want to be a doctor or not. What will tell you if you want to be a doctor or not is all the gross stuff. That's how I found out I didn't want to be a doctor. Ugh, gross. Ugh.
I would also say, Matt, as well, because a lot of students get very fixated over work experience. And I've had conversations with students who feel like they can't do any preparation for their tests because they need to do a month's of work experience over the summer or something. Actually, all this is about is you being able to reflect on the work experience that you've done. You don't get sort of extra points for having done 5 months of work experience as opposed to a week. It's your ability to reflect on what you've done and talk about why it's important and how it's helped galvanize your decision to study medicine that's important. So some students will do less than a week of work experience and get an offer.
And there are, I believe, all kinds of virtual work experiences available. I don't know about a great deal about them, but we'll be talking in much more detail about all of this in 2 weeks' time. And I will have asked Rohan some of the answers because he's the one who knows about medicine being a doctor. Ed asks about our help across a range of subjects. Yep. We work with students studying, I believe we've got someone in for every subject now, I think with the possible exception of Anglo-Saxon at Cambridge. That'll be fun to track, actually. We should look into that. And we also help students who are applying for postgraduate courses. I did a postgraduate course at Cambridge myself. And we have expertise right across the board. Particularly for postgraduate courses, we have quite a few PhD students who work with us as tutors. So if you're interested in getting support about advanced maths, questions of AI alignment, things like that, we will have someone who is on their way to a maths PhD who you can speak to and who will be able to give you helpful advice on that question. I will not be able to give you helpful advice because I know nothing about these questions, but we can definitely find you someone. We have quite literally thousands of people in our network, so we're more than happy to facilitate those kinds of conversations. Gabriella asked about specific GCSE grades. I would have to double check this. I don't know if there is a specific GCSE achievement grade for English and maths, but again, if you're going in with a 5, with a 4, that's going to cause problems. And if you're applying as a non-native English speaker, then they're going to want you to be doing an IELTS test as well. So that's something to bear in mind. And I think, unless any other questions pile in the next couple of minutes, we'll finish with Antonio's question, James. So James, how do you get the most out of the student portal?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So actually quite helpful for everybody, I suppose. All of the programs that we have a program guide, essentially. So the program guide gives a timeline over the year and it essentially breaks down the year month by month so that students have a clear understanding of what they need to be doing. So what 10 things do I need to do in April? What 11 things do I need to do in May? So that's something that all of the subjects will have. So kind of once you have access to that portal, hypothetically, then you'd have access to the program guide for your subject. And then that helps to give you a very clear structure to be effective using, all of the resources and things. We don't want to just throw thousands and thousands of questions at you and, wish you well. We want to give you a very clear understanding of how to utilize all of this stuff. So yeah, a program guide is how.
Lovely stuff. Well, I think that sort of does it for the day. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you for such good questions. I would say your questions were much better than last time. So take that, people who were here last time. There will be a recording of this webinar available on the UniAdmissions website. It normally takes a few days to go up. I don't think anyone's working tomorrow, so it won't be there tomorrow. Normally Wednesday or Thursday it gets there, right, James?
Yeah, sometimes a little bit earlier, actually. Yeah, so I think sort of Tuesday would be the earliest, but yeah, look out for it midweek, I'd say.
Yeah, so you can find that on the website sometime next week. I'm not an expert on when they go up because I do not like to watch myself. But if you do like to watch me, there are, good God, perhaps 100 hours of me that you can watch. I would not recommend that to anyone. Even my wife doesn't enjoy my company that much, but perhaps you are different. So I think that all that leaves us to say is thank you so much for joining me this week, James. Have a happy Easter and good luck with Ramadan to those of you who are fasting at the moment. I'm in awe of anyone who can pull that off, especially the no drinking business. It's been quite warm this week. Have a lovely Easter next week. Have a lovely Eid in, well, we'll see you before then, but Eid in about 4 weeks. Yeah. Have a lovely weekend, everyone, and we will speak to you in 2 weeks' time when we'll be talking about medicine. So something to look forward to there. Maybe James will be joining me. Maybe he won't. Who can say? Have a lovely weekend, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.